Next, we will have a full discussant to listen further discussion on the issues surrounding migrant care workers, not limited to the presentation today. So let me first introduce each discussant briefly. The first discussant is Ms. Sug Heo. She is a representative of a Women Migrants Human Rights Center of Korea. The center is supporting migrant women in Korea by providing counseling, education, and training services to them. And the second discussant is Dr. Elizabeth King. So she is a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, adjunct professor of Georgetown University. Also, she is the editor of the Journal of Development Effectiveness and a board member of several global NGOs. The third discussant is Dr. Seori Choi. She is a senior policy researcher at the Migration Research and Training Center in Korea. As a policy advisory, she has introduced global immigration policies and suggested recommendations to Korean government. The last discussant is Professor Hyun Mee Kim. She is a professor of cultural anthropology at the Yonsei University. She is also serving the president of the Korean Association of Women's Studies. She also co-edited a book, The Multiculturalism in East Asia, a Transnational Exploration of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in 2016. So to save time, so I should say I can only give 9 minutes to each discussant. So I would like to first ask Ms. Sug Heo. So please come to the podium. So can you all the discussant come to the podium? Podium. Yeah, I will first ask the Ms. Sug Heo, and followed by Dr. Elizabeth King, and then the Dr. Seori Choi, and lastly Dr. Hyun Mee Kim.
네, 안녕하세요. 방금 소개받은 호영숙입니다.
Hello everyone. As introduced, I am Ho
네,
Young-suk.
지금 네, 뒤에 보이고 있는.
Can you see the slides that I've prepared?
네.
Are they on screen?
네네.
Yes, I think they're on screen.
저는 한국 이주여성의권센터에서
So I work at Women Migrants Human Rights Center of Korea, and today's topic is not really a topic that gains a lot of spotlight on the field as well. So I would like to thank the organizers for setting this topic for the discussion of this conference. I think that we need to change the question. We need to change our problem or question, as Dr. Chon Jeon mentioned earlier. Is there demand for migrant care work? Rather than asking this question, we need to ask whether in the care work market, the migrant female care workers are considered for fair pay and work hours. We need to ask these questions first. As a field worker, that's what I believe. And you probably heard about Mayor Oh's statement, and the media is using terms like Southeast Asian aunties, but these are statements made based on not promising the labor rights and using cheap laborers to respond to the current labor shortage that we have right now. But this is a discrimination against the underdeveloped Asian countries. So as many of our presenters mentioned earlier, if we say that we bring in the cheapest of the cheapest care laborers, and if we say that they can be replaced, and if we think of them as functional workforce, how can we actually provide quality care work? This is another question that we should ask ourselves. In fact, in Korea,
이주돌봄 노동은 H2 비자에서 사실상 공식화되었다라고
the
생각됩니다.
Korean work market is already open to female migrants thanks to the H2 visa. H2 visa was adopted in 2007 based on the special employment permit system. This system is only applicable to Korean diasporas in China and former CIS regions. This visa is used for people to work in private nursing jobs or domestic work jobs. So it's equivalent to a care work visa for female. And many Chinese Koreans who are middle-aged use this visa to work in Korea. So it's different from the E9 visa of EPS, the regular EPS. We see more women who get this H2 visa to work in Korea. But I think there's something that we need to focus here. When we say employment permit system, before we had this system, there were a lot of difficulties that we underwent. We used to have the industrial training system in the 1990s, and this was changed to the employment permit system in 2004. And the problem back then was that the status of trainees made workers suffer from long hours, low wage work, and poor working conditions. So from the perspectives of human rights violation, people changed the trainee system to employment permit system. So despite its limitations, EPS was an important historical progress because it would provide social insurances and minimum wages to our migrant workers. It provides the equal rights to migrant workers as domestic workers. So in that sense, the EPS system was a progress. For sure, there are still exceptions. For instance, if you have a small business size or if you work in a specific industry, there are exceptional provisions. But the smaller your business is, you will find more female workers, and more of them will be migrant female workers. So regardless of the business size, the Labor Relations Act should be applied to address the problems that I just mentioned so that the workers do not experience exploitation. But on the flip side, trying to create a market where female workers with ultra-low wage are used to address the demand is a big problem. But one of the programs, the seasonal worker program, actually digresses the progress that we have made through the EPS. So the seasonal worker program allows you to work in the agricultural fisheries sector during the planting or harvesting seasons. It's run by the regional governments. And we're seeing an increase of these seasonal workers. So they are given the minimum wage, but they only get the social coverages in terms of industrial accident insurances, and workers who live in areas where the regional government signed an MOU with another regional area in Korea can apply for this visa, for this program and come to Korea. So you have to be the marriage migrant's hometown family or relative to be able to come as seasonal workers. In the past, the marriage migrant women's families could come to Korea for child care support purposes only, and under this visa, you cannot get a job. Employment is banned, and the reason why this was banned to prevent any labor market disruptions. So the family members of female marriage migrants could only come to Korea for long-term, for childcare purposes. But now, with the seasonal worker program, these people who come to Korea for childcare purposes can now work to meet those labor shortages. It's really contradictory. All the short-term visa within 90 days bans you from working in Korea, but for seasonal worker only, the Korean government allows them to work and get a job in Korea. So it's really contradictory, but it seems like it's being operated in a non-contradictory manner. So we are viewing these workers as functional, instrumental workers and use them when needed. And all of these views are reflected in the migrant policy in general.
이주 돌봄 노동에 대해서 최저임금 얘기가 나오고 있는
So
것이
we keep
아닌가
talking
싶은
about
생각이
the
들어서
ultra
굉장히 우려가
cheap
됩니다.
labor, the migrant labor, and that's, I think, the background of why we talk
사실
about
이러한
this from the cost
정책의
perspective is
여러
what I've
가지
just explained.
시선이나 이런 것들은 가족 간에서도 저는 투영이 된다라고
And I
생각되는데
think this
그것을
impacts
가장
our
잘
family
보여주는 게
values as
결혼
well.
얘기였습니다라는 생각이 듭니다.
And the most representative
결혼
case is the
여성의
female marriage
책임은
migrants.
사실 한국 국적자, 그러니까
So
한국인
female marriage
배우자가 혼인
migrants
상태를
need
유지하고
to
있는지
be
그리고
married
한국
to a Korean national.
국적의 자녀를
They need to
출산했는지
maintain their
그
marriage.
자녀를
They
양육하고
need to give
있는지 여부에
childbirth
따라서
and rear their
한국
children.
체류가
And
좌우되도록
based on
설계되어
that,
있습니다.
the woman's
그래서
Korean
사실상
stay is
재생산
determined.
노동 과를 요구받고
So,
있습니다.
in other words, they are
그리고
forced
아까
to engage in the
말씀드렸다시피
reproductive
이주 여성의
roles.
친정 가족은
And as I mentioned, the hometown
결혼한
families
이주
of
여성이
these
아이를
female
낳아서 그 아이를 양육할 때
marriage
그것도
migrants
단기
can
체류
only
될
come
때까지만 장기 체류를
for
일부
child
허용하고
care
있습니다.
purposes, and they can
그래서 이것이
stay for a
가정
limited
내에서도
amount of
이주
years
여성들은 사회적으로
for child
노동자로
care
인식되는 게 아니라
purposes.
가정 내에서도 살림을
So we're
사람,
now
가정노동을
not
하는 사람,
viewing
이런
these
거에
migrants as
훨씬
family
더
members, but
집중될
as
가능성이
workers,
높습니다.
as caregivers. And this
그래서 저는
trend may
어떤 결혼 이주
may
여성에 대한
intensify in the
돌봄과
future if we
재생산
keep the current
역할을
policies.
제도적으로
If we
강제하는 것과
the
중국이나
strengthening the
주변 지역의
institutional
동포를
enforcement
대상으로
of reproductive
이제
roles and only
동포
providing
정책인데 사실상 인력 정책인
visas to
거.
diasporas.
그리고
We say
결혼
it's
이주 여성의
overseas Korean policies,
친정
but it's actually a program to secure overseas workers and actually making that gap to be used for seasonal workers to come as family members and still get a job. All of this view migrant workers as functional workers, as tools. We think of them as means. And I hate to imagine it, and Dr. John mentioned this earlier, but I wonder if the care work market is satisfactory to the migrant workers, and what happens to the life of the marriage migrant workers. And if certain people are not entitled to basic things, and if the society justifies this, what does care mean in such society? So can we still have discussions on social care in a progressive manner? So I thought about these questions and wanted to ask them. So I think I kept on time. Thank you.
Elizabeth King, would you start your discussion?
Is it okay if I take my mask off from here? Okay, thanks. Hello, good afternoon, you're still there. Because it's the end of the day, I'm going to make it easy for all of us, and I will not take up the 9 minutes that I'm supposed to be given. So you saw a lot of numbers from all the speakers of the session. The numbers about the need for care, demand, how big that demand is, and also the fact that with the trend in the demand the way it is, that there will be shortage of supply of care workers. That assumes that the economy of care is a closed economy. So there is, when we start to talk about migrant care workers, we're accepting the fact that we don't have a closed economy, and that we can open that care economy. And that's why we're talking about the migrant care workers. Okay? So the bottom line of this discussion is this one thing, right? Which is that in order to think about the migrant care workers as an important part of care, the supply of care, we have to think about care policy in a coherent way. That is, not just the domestic, local, not domestic as in local, but also the migrant workforce that can come in. And that is not a fixed resource, right? So the question really is, how do we come up with a coherent care policy that has a migration policy that will open the supply of migrant care workers and be fair to everybody and improve the conditions of care workers. So that's the challenge of of what we have really for policy. And the way to, okay, so I've basically stopped looking at my slides. But my point is, in order to come up with that care policy, we need to understand the process of migration or the economics of migration, to understand that the people who migrate to a country are not necessarily there for care. Nonetheless, if they are in a country as migrants, they are potential migrant care workers. What are some of the things that we need to understand about the migration, the people who migrate into a country? One, they may not intend to be permanent migrants, and that they're only temporary migrants or transitory migrants, right? So we have to ask ourselves this question as we think about a policy for attracting them, for keeping them, for protecting them, for making them more effective care workers, and for protecting the people we care for, whom they will care for, right? Those are the objectives. So we need to remember that migrants are not necessarily permanent. They can be temporary. They are not necessarily in the care sector. They can be in other care sectors. They can be voluntary migrants. That means to say they choose to migrate to a country. Or they can be involuntary migrants. That means to say basically the push factor for them, the push factors for migration are stronger than the pull factors. The pull factors are people who migrate for the sake of employment, better wages, better living, educational opportunities for their children, more satisfying professions, and so on and so forth. Those are the pull factors. The push factors are persecution, lack of freedoms, poverty, environmental factors, and so forth and so on. So that's the environment in which we're talking about a good and effective policy for migrant care workers. And we cannot forget that. So far we've been talking a lot about, although not exclusively, about the contribution of the migrant care workers. To be able to really discuss a coherent policy, care policy, with migrant care workers, we need to think about those conditions of why people migrate, right? And by doing so, by understanding that, we can come up with a care policy with migration that's better, okay? So, one example of a care policy, this is my third point. One example of a migrant care policy that we've not discussed is bilateral migration agreements. That means to say, so these are basically, this is really thinking about the role of the state, so the role of policy. And there are countries, for example, that really do intentional or deliberate recruitment of care workers. Saudi Arabia, United States are examples. Singapore is an example. At the same time, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are also countries that deliberately push migration as a means to earn remittances. That was mentioned by a couple of the speakers earlier, right? And remittances in some countries, such as the Philippines, make up 10% of the GDP. Important enough to actually be an economic growth policy or an economic policy. So important enough as a source of foreign exchange. So what do these kinds of, these interests on both the countries that are the receiving countries and the sending countries, they have resulted in bilateral agreements which determine how many migrants, what occupations, even wages, but but especially the kind of treatment that they get, or their protection, level of protection from mistreatment. But in general, these are also these kinds of policies or arrangements actually mean that this migration is temporary or transitory because it's contractual. Okay? But this is an example, so I will limit it to this example. This is an example of the role of the state that can help protect or ensure quality of care to some degree. I agree with that. But it also can be a way to protect the security, safety of the migrant care workers, which is something that we want, okay? And probably also the kinds of, protection from crime and some countries, the sending countries like the Philippines, for example, have a lot of requirements. So the requirements for a potential migrant. A potential migrant can migrate only for care in order to, or rather, they can migrate for care if they have met certain requirements, such as even training. So those bilateral migration agreements can be very important. But they don't only have to be bilateral. They can also be regional migration agreements. So the ASEAN, for example, for Asian countries would be one place where that can actually develop and implement possibly a regional migration policy for the sake of care workers. All right, so those are just 3 points. Migration, we need to look at the reason for policy in general and understand the environment. The reason why we want that is because we want a coherent care policy. And third, the policies can be, especially once you start to recognize that you can have voluntary migration and not necessarily involuntary, and that those can be negotiated by government to government or governments within a region, then that gives us another layer of a type of policy that so far we haven't discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for Dr. Kim for your discussion. So now, Dr. Seori Choi, could you please share your discussion?
예, 안녕하십니까 이민정책연구원의
Hello
최서리입니다.
everyone, I am Seori.
그 연구팀이 몇 년 전에
I know that our research team began this project a few years ago and I was part of the audience, and
프로젝트에 대해서 알게 됐는데
that's when I learned about the project. And it seems like the research team, through numerous research and networking, have advanced the discussion quite a lot. So I want to first congratulate you on your achievements. And in Korea, the care work and migrant care workers, the topic has unfolded differently from other Asian countries like Hong Kong and Singapore. The Korean diasporas who already have labor rights have been introduced to the care sector, but we're not opening up the care labor market to other foreigners. Other Asian receiving countries have decades of years of experience of dealing with migrant care workers, but in Korea, for the past 10 years, we've only talked about the idea of opening up the care labor market. And I think we've just begun to conduct researches and studies on this topic. If we look at the discussions that took place in the past few years, there were radical claims saying that we should introduce cheap, non-minimum wage migrant work laborers, and all government agencies were against this stance. And even recently, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance created the Population Policy Task Force and set this as an official policy agenda, but there's still oppositions from the Ministry of Employment, Labor, and Ministry of Health and Welfare. But compared to when the idea was proposed a few years ago, I do sense some change in the stances of our government. So against this backdrop, I think today's discussion is not just meaningful in academic terms, but it can provide meaningful information to the policymakers in Korea. If we look at the discussions that took place in government agencies, Ministry of Strategy and Finance expected the influx of migrant care workers to help the career disruptions of female workers in Korea. The Ministry of Employment and Labor were worried that the migrant care workers would interfere with the middle-aged domestic Korean women's workers. So at the end of the day, the migrant care worker influx was a problem that was regarded as domestic female workers. And I also had a negative view on bringing in migrant workers, but my views have also changed. And one thing I was not sure though was would the inflow of foreign migrant workers actually interfere and disrupt the jobs of middle-aged women in Korea? Because migrant workers and middle-aged Korean female workers have different characters. So I wasn't sure if they would replace the domestic workers' jobs or if there was a separate set of market. And I may sound naive, but do we have to see care work in the perspective of only middle-aged women? I think this view itself has a problem. So in that sense, Professor Peng's presentation and her mentioning of the diversity of or various care demands, I realized that the migrant care workers could play various roles in our care work market. And global migration could actually provide better jobs to workers living in low-wage countries. So this can actually provide some food for thought for our immigration policy researchers. And Korea provides minimum wage to migrant workers. We have been upholding this labor migration principles. So I do think Korea's choice can actually have an impact to the entire Asian labor market. And Dr. Jeon's research, I do believe, will serve as a very meaningful document. If you're interested in hiring migrant care workers, and I was really surprised that some people did not even care or they were hesitant to hiring these foreign workers. So the responses that you've collected were very simple, but if you could sort of provide an in-depth analysis on the household income, the occupation, and gender, that would serve to be more helpful. And I don't think the government internally thinks all users as one group. So we need more extra analysis. Even if we have a pilot project, we would have to talk about who's going to be part of this project, and individual households' characteristics will matter. And Professor Peng could not talk about the Canadian case due to time constraints, but Korean researchers have reviewed the Canadian case. I think one thing that we found hard to understand was the policy or the system, how it was actually being built. I know that you have a point system to select those applicable for permanent residency, and I know skills and wage is an important requirement. For a long time, seasonal workers in Canada were not given the opportunity to apply for permanent residency. Then how come you are providing the opportunity to apply for permanent residency to migrant care workers? What's the background? What was the context of this? And in Canada, did you acknowledge the expertise and skills of care workers from the very beginning? And if we look at the migrant labor policies in Korea to non-ethnic Koreans, we only allow them to work for temporary timeline, and we have really strict requirements to acquire the permanent residency. When you want to apply for permanent residency, your level of education, your income, and your Korean proficiency are very important. Of course, you could learn Korean while you stay in Korean, but your education level or your income level is determined when you become an adult. So it's not something that you can change. It's really heavily impacted by the socioeconomics. So how will Korea acknowledge these workers' qualifications that's directly linked with their settlement in Korea. So I wonder how the Canadian government, how much they acknowledge the expertise or the value of their skills of the migrant care workers. And Korea's migrant work-related policies have changed thanks to the much efforts of the academic circle. I truly believe so. And compared to other Asian countries, the Korean government is really open to the voices of the civil society. I know that we have a lot of people from the Ministry of Justice here. That's how the Korean government is interested in this issue. And when we introduce a new system and operate a new system, there's bound to be trials and errors. And in a situation where we're having a rapid aging society, and before we face a severe shortages of care workers, we should prepare the relevant rules and regulations in advance. And it's really important to promote the value of care work, and we need to restructure the social structure so that we can actually provide care in our everyday life, and we need to increase the rewards for the care work, and we need to respect the individual's choice when they decide to work as care workers, and we should not leave this job for somebody else. We need to give more options and more variety of options to help people work as care workers and move as migrants. So how Korea creates the system will determine as to how it will lead changes in the Asian regions. Against this backdrop, I know that POSCO also in your citizenship office had interest in this issue. Hiring people within households could be burdensome in Korean societies. So if the Korean companies and the households co-invest in childcare facilities, I wonder what all of our presenters and discussants think about this potential idea. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting discussion and interesting questions to presenters. Look forward to listen the answers from our presenters later. Okay, so our last the discussant is Dr. Hyun Mee Kim. So would you share your discussion with us?
네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 그 의미 있는 토론에
Good afternoon.
서울대학교 국제이주와 포용사회센터, 서울대학교 국제학대학원하고
This very meaningful conference is co-organized by the CTMS and also the KAWS, and I am very honored and thankful that I am participating as a discussant, the last discussant of this conference. The agenda that was dealt with in the presentations by Professor Ito Peng, Seo Ju-yeon, and Chun Ji-won deal with the conditions for redistribution and re-evaluation so that we can transition to a care society. They all talk about how care work is being undervalued. So, but the demand for care work is rising.
저임금 노동을 할 수 있는 이 저소득층 여성과 이주민만을 돌봄 노동자로 상상한다.
in low
income 어떻게 데려올 것인가,
low income
어떻게
women
관리할 것인가에
and
관심을 갖고
also
있다. 이런 주제로 계속 이제 돌봄
migrant
노동에 대한
women
정책과
will
의제가 되고
be
있는데 그러면 우리가 이 전제 안에서
brought in
오늘
to
말씀해
meet
주신
the
선생님들은
increasing
현재 이 여성 이주자가
demand, care work,
부담하는
care
돌봄의
demand,
불균형성과
and
이
this
돌봄
all
노동의
this
질과
kind of
지속하는 위해서 어떻게 전기 지구적인 개입과 국가
distorted
기업, 시민사회
views
NGO가
have
역할을
led
할
to
것인가에
inequalities as
그다음에
well as
돌봄 노동자의
imbalances
재생산을
in the care
위해서
sector
고려할
and the
돌봄
care
노동
economy.
환경이 어때야
And so I
되는가?
think
이
studies
주제를
on this
다뤄주신 것
issue
같아요. 우리가 앞으로
are very
계속 논의해야
important,
될
and
주제인 것
that was
같습니다.
what the
저는 첫
presenters have
번째로
touched on.
이제
So these were very important issues.
여성학회
But as
여성의
the
경제적
president
참여와
of
돌봄 노동의 수요를
KAWS,
너무 기계적으로 비례하고 있는데 그렇다면
I would like to
돌봄
warn
노동자가
against
가장
the
높은
mechanical
퍼센티지를
attitude of
입주가
dividing
노동자로 가장
the
많이
care work or care
들어와 있는
labor
걸프국가,
into supply and
중소국가의
demand.
여성 경제 참여율이 높나요?
or saying that
그러면
saying that
여성
there is
경제
a
참여율이
correlation
상대적으로 높은
between the female
아이
labor
돌봄,
force
입주
participation
돌봄이가
rate
맞나요?
and the
전혀 아니죠.
demand for
그래서
care
우리 한국
or the
사회가
care
지금 어떤
work
착각과
care
착시를
economy.
통하여 현재의
That's not true for
이
the Arab
노동시장과
countries
기업
or the Gulf
반영에서의
countries.
성 불평등성을
So
돌봄
gender
노동을 여성들이
equality,
해야 되기 때문에 육아나 이런 걸 해야 하기 때문에
yes, it is
경제
an
활동에 제대로
important
참여하지 못해서
issue.
경력 단절이 된다. 이런 말로 지금 유도를 해나가고 있어요. 그래서 저는 뭐
And they're saying that
걸프
there is a
국가의 이
demand for
사례들을
care,
통해서 또는 아시아
and
국가의
this
사례를
will be
통해서
growing as more and more women
솔직히
participate in the labor force. But this is not a given. It's not. It should not be taken for granted.
어퍼 클래스만 이 돌봄 노동자를 지금 집에 데리고 있죠. 그다음에 싱가포르, 홍콩,
For example, in the Philippines, it is only high-income families that are able to hire domestic workers or care workers.
아주 조그만
And in
아파트에서도
Singapore,
그 돌봄 노동자의 건강한 재생산을 막을 만큼 어렵게 할 만큼 그런 열악한 조건 안에서 했기 때문에 사건이 한두 개 나는 게 아니에요.
There are very a lot of cases of sexual violence, rape, and even homicide in countries receiving countries of migrant care workers. And all these are huge problems, social problems. So economic participation and the stopping of women's careers. So in order to prevent that, we should bring in migrant workers, migrant care workers. That kind of rationale or that kind of rhetoric is quite problematic.
아주 표준적이고 이상적인 노동자로 여전히
So we should
상상하면서
be guarded against that.
야근이나 아니면 12시간 뭐 그렇게 근무를 시켜도 아무 문제가 없는 그런 방식의 모델이 강하고 있기 때문에
And it would lead to a migrant care model or employment model that will view care workers as very exploitable commodities. So in order to prevent that kind of distorted model from being generated, our priority should lie not in meeting the needs of the demand for care, but in achieving gender equality in the labor market. And also we have to focus on democratizing families, the democratic distribution of care work within the family. That has to be pursued.
상황이라고 생각을 합니다. 하지만 현재 한국 정부가
However,
국가 보육 시설이라든가 그런
the Korean government, when it comes to childcare facilities and all that, these childcare facilities are insufficient. So, in order to keep women from get women to keep providing care, women are kept, are forced to choose to become irregular workers and to take on only part-time jobs so that they can continue to fulfill their duties as caregivers. So they're not able to climb up the career ladder. So these are issues that we have to take up in this discourse, care discourse. Many people, many of the presenters have talked about how care is something very deeply personal, but at the same time social, and that it requires global migration as well. And so Professor Ito Peng and also someone called Diana has talked about how we need to visualize, to make visible care, how much demand there is for care, and how much time is spent on caregiving. So we have to look at all that in order to come up with a fair redistribution of care work. So there were 3 R's, and now Professor Ito Peng has added 2 more R's. reward and representation. So a more balanced and fair care economy must be put in place, must be established. And that should take place, precede any migrant care policies. Yes, care demand is growing and there is a shortage of care services in Korea. But we have to look at the specific characteristics of the care economy and the care work in Korea. There is a double system in Korea where there is even in the care economy and the care work, there are double standards. There are male migrant workers as well as female migrant workers, and there is gender segmentation even in care work, especially when it comes to long-term care for the elderly. So many people point out that the long-term care is important, but we have a lot of male workers who are coming in as long-term care workers. But what are these men? What kind of workers are they? They used to work in the construction industry in Korea. They were ethnic Korean Chinese who came, and now they are too old and too weak to continue working in the construction sector, so they have transitioned to the care sector. So you have these ethnic Korean Chinese men who are populating the care sector in Korea. So we have to think about all that. So even these migrant workers, they are aging. So these migrant care workers, they need care as well. So the principle of the care economy says that everyone deserves to be cared for, and they also have the duty to care for others. So in this global care economy and this care market, we have to look at the personal aspects, the community aspects, the state aspects, and all that. And in order to strike a balance among all these aspects, we have to look at the 5 R's as explained by Professor Peng. And another thing that I would like to point out is the platform service. Care work is now being brought into the platform work. So you have standby workers who will be on call, and they will go provide care work for about 3 hours. So it's like on-demand care workers. And these migrant care workers, they need to have a deep understanding of the diet and the nutrition, as well as the living conditions and culture of Korean families in order to provide a high quality of care. But this kind of on-demand care work does not take any of that into account. How will this kind of platform care work negatively impact the quality of care is another thing that we have to think about. Yes, that wraps up my discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all discussants for sharing your insight and feedback. It was a great opportunity to think more about the implication for Korean society and how we should prepare it. Thank you for joining us to this wonderful session. I'm very sorry. It's the time's up, so it was very unfortunate to have more time to discuss these issues. But I'm looking forward to seeing continuing and fruitful discussion and further development on this issue. Thank you.